dynamic potential of imagining the impossible. I'm going to start by asking, is it really possible to imagine something impossible? We have some contrary opinion by Hume, who said that the impossible cannot be conceived. So essentially equating what is truly impossible with something which is unconceivable. But Hegel was not on the same line there. He said that this is kind of a prejudice from logic, that we cannot imagine contradictions. And indeed, I think that we can. Otherwise, my talk would be over immediately. Conceive, describe, and also believe. Sometimes we can believe the impossible. However, not all impossibilities are the same. And the weaker the tie between reality and the impossibility we're trying to conceive, the harder the challenge that we have in order to be able to do that. And during the presentation, you will see this BR acronym somewhere, which is suggestions for the breakout room discussion. So this is a possible suggestion to discuss how difficult it is to imagine something which is truly impossible. And to give you an example of, we've seen the Encyclopedia of the Possible. Everybody, I believe, in this conference has been involved in some way. But there is also an Encyclopedia of the Impossible, which is the Codex Seraphinianus, which is a collection of images which are totally imaginary and impossible, described by an equivalently imaginary language, which has been tried to be deciphered for many years without any success. So when we look at the Codex Seraphinianus, this is totally meaningless, has no use, has no usefulness or effectiveness, or does it? Is there any usefulness in an encyclopedia of the impossible? So I'm going to tie this discussion to creativity, of course, and starting from the standard definition, which I call the static definition of creativity, there are two requirements: originality and effectiveness, which you all know, and we have all used it in some form. I say that this definition is static because in order for creativity to exist, you must recognize somebody, some group, according to some culture, must recognize here and now the presence of originality and effectiveness. But this is not the entire phenomenon. Actually, this is a very, very small part of the phenomenon. It completely fails to include the process in which originality and effectiveness have not been generated yet, or perhaps they have been generated, but they have not been recognized by yourself, by the creator, or by the outside world. And we have infinite examples for this. So the fact that this static definition does not cover the entire creativity phenomenon is another possible topic for discussion. And in terms of the impossible, if you generate an idea which is impossible, it probably is very original or truly original, but lacks effectiveness, lacks value, especially if it's an impossible idea for something that would be, for example, in technology or science. There is no value to that. But this is another problem with that definition that we can modify if we add one word, which is potential, which transforms the definition from static to dynamic. What we need is a potential for originality and a potential for effectiveness. This potential may be latent, may be not recognized. It will be there during the creative process. And it might be there in the outcomes of the process, but still not recognized. We could be in a state that we call of creative inconclusiveness. But for sure, when you generate an idea which is impossible, it's not only original, but it might have a very large potential for effectiveness. Because the dynamic definition of creativity forces you to ask, whenever you see an idea, what are the consequences? How can we develop this further? And starting from the impossible is a very good position to generate ideas that are truly creative. So the game of creativity is really a game of potential. the more you challenge the state of the art, so the higher is the potential that you have to really find something which is original and effective. So to imagine the impossible, which comes back to the title of this presentation, is certainly a challenge to what we call reality, or the beliefs that we have about reality. And therefore, it's a tool that we can use. However, it's not the end of the process. The dynamic process actually never ends. It's an interconnection of creativity episodes. So to imagine the impossible is an orbit. You get out of what we call the shared domain of knowledge. And now you are in a good position to come back to Earth with something which is truly original and also potentially effective. I'm going to discuss now in the second part different kinds of impossibilities, 3 of them at a personal level in terms of perception, emotions, and cognition, and 3 of them at a more larger, broader picture level or universal impossibilities, sociocultural, scientific, and semantic impossibilities. So one more topic for the breakout room could be to see if this list to you is complete, or there could be some different forms of impossibility to be added to this list. So starting from perceptual impossibility, we perceive the world through our senses, which are, however, limited. And we tend to think that something that is not perceivable is impossible. But of course, that is not true. On the other hand, in the world of magics, of course, we know that this is exactly what magicians do. They exploit the limitations in our perception system to make us believe that something impossible that has happened in front of our eyes. And coming to the electromagnetic field and the propagation of that field, it's a physical phenomenon which is totally invisible to our senses. It can actually only be measured through technology. And therefore, when Guglielmo Marconi was performing his first experiments and laying out his first networks with wireless telegraphy, he was considered to be a wizard because people did not understand how this was possible, the wizard. And I invite you to see the similarities between this magician and this picture of Guglielmo Marconi. Another form of impossibility is something which is more related to how we feel about ourselves, emotional impossibility. So our personal identity, and through our development, we go through several phases in this sense, forces us to think that we might not be able to do things. And this feeling of impossibility might not even be aware. We might not even be aware of that. And sure that Ron Beghetto, that will follow me in the third talk of today, might even touch upon this kind of issue that involves creative mortification that can introduce barriers in our development and make us feel that something is impossible for us. So for the breakout room, what is the value in terms of clinical intervention, if you want, of imagining the impossible for me? So to go beyond the barriers that I have created, or maybe the environment has created around me during my development. A third kind of impossibility at personal level is what comes out of reasoning, logic. So we can establish that something is impossible through our rational thinking. And from a philosophical point of view, actually, this is a very long discussion about the worlds of impossibility. And here you see the square of opposition that comes out of semiotics and renders impossibility opposed not only to possible, but also to what is necessary. Of course, there are also impossibilities that are shared between humans at a so-called larger or universal level. From a sociocultural point of view, if an entity cannot exist in our society, it's because we believe it cannot happen, it cannot exist. So, for example, freedom in a country where you have a dictatorship may seem to be something impossible. And today we know that we are fighting against post-truths, and to dismantle the post-truth seems to be impossible because scientific data is not enough. It's not enough to dismantle the post-truth. So what is the value, again, what is the value of challenging impossibilities at sociocultural level? What are the political implications of that? This is a topic for discussion. From the scientific point of view, this is perhaps the most difficult kind of impossibility to challenge, because in this case, it's based on science, it's based on data. Some things are obvious that are impossible. For example, if you imagine two suns in our solar system, it's not difficult to imagine. You can draw it, of course, but we know it's completely impossible. On the other hand, there are other forms of impossibility, like, again, I have to speak about Marconi again. When he tried the first experiment of transatlantic transmission from England to Canada, to Newfoundland, the mathematicians of the epoch had proved completely the impossibility of that experiment. He believed in the impossible, and he was able to prove that actually this was possible, even though he performed the experiments in December. So that was a very, very cold month and windy month in Canada. The antennas were very, very tall because it was using very low frequencies, so very, very long wavelengths. And the winds, the gusting winds in Canada had the antennas collapse down. But he believed in the impossible so much that he raised the antennas with kites, and he actually was able to receive the signal across the Atlantic through antennas that were held up by kites. So what kind of innovation, what is the value in terms of technological and scientific innovation of challenging what we believe to be impossible in science? And finally, semantic impossibility, which means something that is in front of us, but apparently has no meaning. The meaning has to be found a posteriori. And this nonlinearity is actually a key to the dynamic creative process. So the writings in the Codex Seraphinianus are, of course, a good example of something that apparently has no meaning. I told you already that many, many people have tried to translate and decipher the code and failed. And he himself, Luigi Serafini, was, in a sense, having fun by drawing this kind of Rosetta Stone here. But another tool that can be used in the creative process, and actually we do use that quite frequently in our sessions, is that of creating metaphors that do not exist, metaphors that have been presented for the first time, or nonce metaphors. And the exercise is to find the meaning of these metaphors a posteriori. A priori, they have no meaning. But once you are able to interpret the nonce metaphor, you are in a very strong position to generate ideas that have potential for both originality and effectiveness. So these are the 9 suggestions for the breakout rooms to discuss perhaps how difficult it is to imagine something which is very far from reality, not only impossible, but very far from reality. Discussion of the Codex Seraphinianus, the mysteries that are in that encyclopedia of the impossible and the implications. Discussion about the static definition of creativity, why it does not really capture the process of the creative phenomenon. Or vice versa, number 4 is the dynamic definition, how thinking and imagining the impossible increases the potential for originality and effectiveness. Number 5 was the list of the typologies of impossibilities. That, of course, is one proposal, but it can be extended. 6, 7, and 8, if we challenge emotional impossibilities, so this is the end of my time, what can we do from a clinical point of view in challenging sociocultural impossibilities as political implications? Scientific possibilities can give you innovation, and semantic impossibilities can give you creative ideas. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll give the floor back to Vlad.